The dusty winds of northern Mexico carried more than sand across the barren landscape on the morning of February 22nd, 1847. They carried the whispers of war, the scent of gunpowder, and the destiny of two nations locked in bitter conflict. General Zachary Taylor stood atop a rocky outcrop near the hacienda of Buena Vista, his weathered hands gripping a brass telescope as he surveyed the most terrifying sight of his military career, stretching across the valley floor like a serpent. Of steel and scarlet, the Mexican army of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna advanced with the precision of a conquering horde. 20,000 seasoned soldiers marched in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming like deadly stars in the morning sun. Artillery pieces rolled forward with thunderous rumbles, pulled by teams of oxen and mules, while cavalry units pranced on the flanks like predators circling wounded prey. The very earth seemed to tremble beneath the weight of Santa Anna's war machine. Taylor's force appeared pitiful by comparison. Fewer than 5,000 American soldiers huddled behind hastily constructed earthworks, their faces pale with the realization that they were outnumbered nearly 4-1. Many were volunteers from Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. Farmers and shopkeepers who had answered their nation's call but had never faced such overwhelming odds. The morning mist clung to their uniforms like shrouds, and more than one man whispered prayers to whatever deity might be listening. The Mexican commander had every reason for confidence. Santa Anna, the self-proclaimed Napoleon of the West, had crushed rebellion after rebellion throughout his turbulent career. His army was fresh from victories in central Mexico, and intelligence reports had convinced him that Taylor's small force would crumble at the first sight of his magnificent host. The previous day, he had sent an ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender, promising that resistance would result in the complete annihilation of the American force. But Taylor, known affectionately to his men as old, rough, and ready, had responded with characteristic defiance. The grizzled veteran of the War of 1812 and countless frontier skirmishes had built his reputation on refusing to yield ground, no matter the odds. His weathered face bore the scars of decades of military service, and his simple uniform, often dusty and wrinkled, contrasted sharply with the elaborate dress of his Mexican counterpart. The battlefield itself seemed designed by Providence for this momentous clash. The hacienda of Buena Vista sat astride the main road to Saltillo, controlling access to the vital supply lines that connected American forces to their bases in Texas. Rocky ridges and deep ravines carved the landscape into a natural amphitheater, where geography would play as important a role as courage in determining the outcome. As dawn broke over the Mexican War's most decisive engagement, neither commander could fully grasp how this single day would reshape the destiny of North America. The battle that was about to unfold would test not only military tactics and individual bravery, but the very character of two emerging nations. In the growing light of that February morning, history held its breath. The first Mexican assault came with the fury of a desert storm, striking the American left flank, where Colonel Archibald yells Arkansas. Cavalry held a precarious position among the rocky gullies. Santa Anna had chosen his point of attack with the calculating precision of a master chess player. Recognizing that if he could turn the American left, Taylor's entire line would collapse like a house of cards built on shifting sand, General Pedro de Amputia's division advanced in 3 massive columns, all their brass buttons and polished weapons, catching the early morning sunlight as they moved forward with parade ground precision. Behind them, Santa Anna's artillery thundered to life, sending iron balls screaming across the valley to crash into the American earthworks, with bone-jarring impacts that sent clouds of dust and debris skyward. The Mexican guns, many of them, captured British pieces from earlier conflicts, outranged and outnumbered Taylor's batteries by a significant margin. The Arkansas horsemen found themselves caught in an impossible position as Mexican lancers swept around their flanks like wolves. Surrounding a wounded deer, Colonel Yell, a former congressman who had traded political debate for military action, struggled to maintain order as his volunteer cavalry faced professional soldiers trained in the European tradition of warfare. The clash of sabers rang out across the valley, punctuated by the crack of pistol shots and the screams of wounded. horses according to historical accounts documented in the Mexican War by K. Jack Bauer. The initial Mexican advance created panic in several American units, with some volunteers breaking ranks and fleeing toward the rear in confusion and terror. Within the first hour of combat, disaster seemed imminent for the American cause. Yale's cavalry crumbled under the relentless pressure, and Mexican infantry began pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. The 2nd Indiana Regiment, positioned to support the cavalry, wavered as enemy soldiers approached their line with bayonets fixed and war cries echoing across the battlefield. Taylor himself rode forward into the chaos, his presence alone serving to steady the wavering troops. The general's calm demeanor under fire had become legendary among his soldiers, and his appearance at the most critical moments often proved decisive. His simple blue uniform, devoid of elaborate decorations, made him an easy target for Mexican sharpshooters, but Taylor seemed oblivious to personal danger as he moved among his men, offering encouragement and tactical guidance. The Mexican advantage in numbers began to tell as fresh battalions continued to feed into the attack. Santa Anna's strategy was working perfectly, drawing the Americans into a grinding battle of attrition that they could not hope to win. His reserves remained intact while Taylor's small force was being stretched to the breaking point. Like a rope under ever-increasing tension tacked in Braxton, Bragg's battery found itself in the thick of the fighting as Mexican cavalry swept around the American positions. The young artillery officer, who would later achieve fame and infamy during the Civil War, directed his guns with deadly precision, sending loads of canister shot into the advancing enemy ranks. The range was so close that Bragg's cannoneers could see the faces of individual Mexican soldiers as they fell to the devastating artillery fire. As the morning wore on, the battle took on the character of a desperate struggle for survival, rather than a conventional military engagement. The American line bent like a bow under enormous pressure, threatening to snap at any moment. Mexican flags advanced steadily forward, marking the inexorable progress of Santa Anna's assault, while American resistance seemed to weaken with each passing hour as the Mexican tide threatened to overwhelm the American positions. Individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos, like stars appearing in a darkening sky. Colonel Jefferson Davis, commanding the 1st Mississippi Rifles, positioned his regiment in a V-shaped formation that would become legendary in military history. The Mississippians, armed with the new model 1841 rifles, possessed a significant advantage in range and accuracy over the smooth-bore muskets carried by most Mexican infantry. When General José Perez's cavalry division thundered toward the American center, Davis's riflemen waited with the patience of seasoned hunters. The colonel, who would later lead the Confederacy during the Civil War, had trained his men to fire in controlled volleys rather than the wild, ineffective shooting that characterized many volunteer units. As the Mexican horsemen approached within effective range, Davis gave the command that would turn the tide of the immediate crisis. The Mississippi Rifles spoke in unison, sending a devastating volley into the charging cavalry. Horses and riders tumbled to the ground in a tangle of flesh and steel, while the survivors reeled back in confusion and terror. The precision of the American fire had shattered what appeared to be an unstoppable charge, buying precious time for Taylor to reorganize his battered line. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay, Jr., son of the famous Kentucky statesman, led his regiment in a desperate counterattack against Mexican forces that had penetrated the American positions. The younger Clay possessed all of his father's oratorical fire, but channeled it into military leadership rather than political rhetoric. His voice carried across the battlefield as he urged his men forward, his sword gleaming in the afternoon sun as he pointed toward the enemy lines. The counterattack initially succeeded in driving back the Mexican advance, but Clay's impetuosity proved his undoing. Leading from the front with characteristic Kentucky courage, he pressed too far forward and found himself surrounded by enemy soldiers. His regiment fought desperately to reach their fallen commander, but Mexican reinforcements arrived too quickly. Clay fell mortally wounded, his sacrifice becoming one of the most poignant stories of the entire Mexican War. Captain John Paul Jones O'Brien's artillery battery anchored the American right flank, where his 4 6-pounder cannons faced overwhelming odds. The Irish-born officer directed his guns with the skill of a master craftsman, switching between solid shot for long-range targets and canister for close-in defense. When Mexican infantry approached within 50 yards of his position, O'Brien's cannoneers loaded their pieces with double charges of canister. Creating a killing field that no human force could cross, the battery's ammunition began to run dangerously low as the afternoon wore on, forcing O'Brien to make increasingly difficult choices about when and where to fire. Each shot had to count, as resupply seemed impossible given the intensity of the Mexican assault. The captain's steady voice could be heard above the din of battle, calling out firing commands and encouraging his men to maintain their positions, despite the overwhelming enemy pressure. Throughout the American line, similar scenes of individual courage played out as ordinary soldiers rose to extraordinary heights. Sergeant Major William Nice of the 3rd Indiana Regiment single-handedly captured a Mexican battle flag after its bearer fell. Within 20 yards of the American trenches, Private Thomas Hoover used his rifle as a club when his ammunition ran out, holding his section of the line until reinforcements could arrive. These acts of heroism began to create a ripple effect throughout Taylor's army, transforming what had appeared to be inevitable defeat into stubborn resistance. The Mexican advance, which had seemed irresistible in the morning hours, began to slow as individual American units found reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Buena Vista battlefield. As General Taylor made the most crucial decision of his military career, with his left flank crumbling and Mexican forces threatening to envelop his entire position, the American commander faced a choice that would determine not only the fate of his army, but potentially the outcome of the entire war. Rather than order a retreat that might save his remaining forces, Taylor chose to gamble everything on a desperate counteroffensive. Captain Braxton Bragg received the order that would make him famous throughout American military history. Taylor's message was characteristically direct. "Double shot your guns and give them hell, Bragg." The young artillery officer understood immediately what his commander intended. Instead of conserving ammunition for a fighting withdrawal, he would expend everything in one massive bombardment designed to shatter the Mexican advance. Bragg's battery, supported by Captain Thomas Sherman's guns and the remaining artillery, pieces still in action, concentrated their fire on the advancing Mexican columns with devastating effect. The American cannoneers worked with desperate efficiency, loading and firing as rapidly as their hot gun barrels would allow. Solid shot tore great gaps in the enemy ranks, while exploding shells created havoc among the closely packed formations. The psychological impact of the concentrated artillery barrage proved as important as its physical destruction. Mexican soldiers, who had advanced confidently throughout the morning, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. The steady drumbeat of artillery explosions disrupted their formations and shattered the momentum that had carried them forward for hours. Colonel William Hardin's Illinois Regiment, positioned in the center of the American line, received orders to advance against what appeared to be overwhelming odds. The volunteers from Illinois had watched their comrades fall throughout the day, and many questioned whether their sacrifice would accomplish anything meaningful. Hardin himself, a veteran of frontier warfare, understood that success depended entirely on timing and coordination with the artillery barrage. As Bragg's guns reached their crescendo, Hardin led his men forward with the battle cry that would become legendary. "Remember Yell?" The reference to Colonel Archibald Yell, killed earlier in the fighting, galvanized the Illinois soldiers and transformed their advance from a military maneuver into a personal mission of vengeance. The unexpected American counterattack caught Santa Anna's forces at the worst possible moment. Mexican units that had been advancing steadily suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions. With American infantry emerging from positions that had appeared abandoned, the confusion multiplied as officers struggled to maintain control over formations that had become scattered by the artillery bombardment. General Pedro Ampudia attempted to rally his division as American forces pressed their advantage. But the momentum had shifted decisively. Mexican soldiers who had fought bravely throughout the morning began to waver as they realized that their numerical superiority was becoming meaningless in the face of determined American resistance and superior artillery support. The tide of battle began to turn as individual Mexican units started falling back toward their original positions. What had begun as an orderly advance transformed into a fighting withdrawal, then into something approaching a retreat. Santa Anna watched in growing alarm as his carefully planned assault dissolved into confusion and disorder. Taylor seized the moment with the instinct of a seasoned commander, ordering his remaining reserves forward to exploit the Mexican confusion. The American line, which had bent nearly to the breaking point, suddenly straightened and began advancing across ground that had been contested for hours. The stars and stripes, which had barely remained visible above the American earthworks, now advanced boldly across the battlefield, as evening shadows began to lengthen across the blood-soaked battlefield. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna faced the most humiliating moment of his illustrious military career. The Mexican commander who had crushed the Texan rebels at the Alamo and had conquered countless enemies throughout his rise to power, now watched his supposedly invincible army recoil from a force less than one-fourth its size. Pride and desperation combined to fuel one final desperate gamble that would determine the ultimate outcome of the Battle of Buena Vista. Santa Anna gathered his remaining reserves for what military historians would later describe as one of the most audacious cavalry charges in the history of the Mexican War. General Anastasio Torrejon's cavalry division, nearly 2,000 strong, had been held in reserve throughout the day's fighting. These were not raw recruits or unwilling conscripts, but professional soldiers trained in the finest European military traditions, mounted on the best horses that Mexico could provide. The Mexican general's plan was elegantly simple and potentially devastating. While his remaining infantry maintained pressure along the American front, Rajan's cavalry would sweep around the American right flank in a massive enveloping movement. If successful, the charge would place Mexican forces directly behind Taylor's positions, cutting off any hope of retreat and forcing the Americans to surrender or face complete annihilation. Captain Washington's battery, positioned on the extreme right of the American line, became the primary target of Santa Anna's final assault. The young artillery officer, unrelated to the first president, despite sharing his surname, commanded only 2 functioning cannons after hours of intense combat. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and several of his cannoneers had been wounded by Mexican sharpshooters who had infiltrated the rocky terrain surrounding his position. The thunder of 2,000 horses' hooves created a sound like approaching earthquake as Torrejon's cavalry began their charge. Mexican lancers rode in the front ranks, their long weapons gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight, while saber-wielding dragoons followed close behind. Battle flags snapped in the wind created by their passage, and war cries in Spanish echoed across the valley as the horsemen approached their target. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the National Archives, the sight of the massive cavalry charge initially created panic among some American units, with witnesses describing it as resembling the charge of mythical centaurs rather than mortal men. Washington's cannoneers loaded their guns with double charges of canister, turning their artillery pieces into giant shotguns capable of devastating effect at close range. The captain waited until the charging cavalry had closed to within 100 yards before giving the command to fire. The discharge of both cannons simultaneously created a sound like thunder, sending hundreds of iron balls screaming into the advancing horsemen. The front ranks of the Mexican cavalry disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dust, but the charge continued with undiminished fury. Wounded horses and riders littered the ground, but the survivors pressed forward with the determination of men fighting for national honor. Torrejon himself rode at the head of his men, his uniform torn by near misses, but his resolve unshaken. Lieutenant Rucker's company of Indiana volunteers found themselves directly in the path of the cavalry charge as Mexican horsemen broke through the American line. The young officer, barely 22 years old, had never faced cavalry in open combat, but his training took over as he formed his men into a square formation designed to repel mounted attack. The collision between Mexican cavalry and American infantry created chaos beyond description. Sabers clashed against bayonets, horses reared and screamed, and men fought hand-to-hand in a struggle that seemed to belong to an earlier, more primitive age of warfare. Dust clouds obscured the battlefield, making it difficult for commanders on either side to understand what was happening or to issue effective orders. For several terrifying minutes, it appeared that Santa Anna's gamble might succeed. Mexican cavalry had penetrated deep into the American positions, and Taylor's entire right flank seemed on the verge of collapse. The fate of the battle, and perhaps the war itself, hung in the balance as individual soldiers fought desperately for survival in the gathering darkness. In the gathering twilight of February 23, 1847, the Battle of Buena Vista reached its climactic moment as exhausted soldiers from both armies fought with the desperate fury of men who understood that survival itself hung in the balance. The Mexican cavalry charge had created chaos throughout the American right flank, but it had also presented Taylor's forces with an unexpected opportunity that would determine the ultimate outcome of this epic struggle. Colonel Jefferson Davis, despite nursing a painful foot wound from earlier in the fighting, recognized that the Mexican cavalry had become dangerously separated from their supporting infantry during their wild charge. The Mississippi colonel, his tactical instincts, sharpened by years of military study and frontier warfare, saw the chance to turn Santa Anna's bold gamble into a devastating defeat for the Mexican cause. Davis gathered the remnants of his 1st Mississippi Rifles along with companies from the 3rd Indiana Regiment and Captain Thomas Sherman's artillery battery. The combined force numbered fewer than 400 men, but they possessed the crucial advantages of position and coordination that the scattered Mexican cavalry lacked. Davis positioned his riflemen in a crescent formation that would allow them to deliver concentrated fire from multiple angles. The dying light of the February sun cast long shadows across the battlefield as Davis gave the command that would seal the fate of Santa Anna's army. The Mississippi Rifles, renowned for their accuracy and range, opened fire with methodical precision. Each shot was carefully aimed, and the superior marksmanship of the American volunteers began to take a terrible toll on the Mexican horsemen who found themselves trapped in an increasingly deadly crossfire. Captain Sherman's artillery added its voice to the deadly chorus, sending loads of canister shot into the confused mass of Mexican cavalry. The range was so close that individual horses and riders could be targeted with devastating effect within minutes. What had been a triumphant charge transformed into a desperate fight for survival as Mexican survivors sought any avenue of escape from the killing field they had inadvertently entered. General Torrejon, wounded but still mounted, attempted to rally his scattered forces for a final effort against the American positions. The Mexican cavalry commander had built his reputation on aggressive leadership and personal courage, but he now faced the harsh reality that his magnificent charge had been turned against him by superior American tactics and firepower. Major Samuel Ringgold's light artillery, racing across the battlefield at full gallop, arrived at the crucial moment to support Davis's infantry. The horse artillery concept, still relatively new in American military doctrine, proved its worth as the mobile guns unlimbered within canister range of the Mexican cavalry and began firing as rapidly as their crews could load and aim. The combined effect of rifle fire, artillery bombardment, tactical positioning created a catastrophe for Santa Anna's final reserves. Mexican cavalry that had charged forward with supreme confidence now found themselves decimated and demoralized. Their formations shattered and their leadership wounded or dead. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical casualties. As news of the disaster spread throughout the Mexican ranks, Santa Anna himself, watching from a distant ridge, understood that his last gamble had failed catastrophically. The Mexican general, who had never before retreated from a battlefield, faced the bitter recognition that his army had been decisively defeated by a force he had expected to crush within hours. The numerical advantage that had seemed so overwhelming at dawn had been neutralized by superior American leadership tactics and individual courage as darkness fell over the Buena Vista battlefield. The sounds of combat gradually faded into the moans of wounded men and the distant rumble of artillery. being withdrawn, Mexican forces began a general retreat toward the south, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape further punishment. The great army that had advanced so confidently that morning now resembled a defeated mob fleeing in disorder. Taylor's exhausted soldiers could barely comprehend the magnitude of their victory. They had faced odds of nearly 4-1 against professional soldiers led by Mexico's most famous general. Yet they had not only survived, but had achieved a decisive triumph that would resonate throughout both nations for generations to come. The dawn of February 24th, 1847, revealed the full scope of the American triumph at Buena Vista as the rising sun illuminated a battlefield strewn with the debris of Santa Anna's shattered army. Mexican equipment lay scattered across the valley floor like the remnants of a mighty storm, while abandoned artillery pieces stood as silent monuments to the previous day's carnage. General Taylor's small force had achieved what military experts had considered impossible, transforming numerical inferiority into decisive victory through superior leadership, individual courage, and tactical brilliance. The casualty figures told the story of the battle's intensity with stark clarity. American losses totaled approximately 750 killed, wounded, and missing, while Mexican casualties exceeded 3,500, including many of Santa Anna's most experienced officers and veteran soldiers. Among the American dead lay some of the war's most promising young leaders, including Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay, Jr., whose sacrifice had galvanized Kentucky regiments throughout the remainder of the conflict. President James Knox Polk received news of the Buena Vista victory in Washington with a mixture of relief and political calculation. The triumph had secured the northern front of the Mexican War at a time when American forces were advancing toward Mexico City from multiple directions. Taylor's success ensured that Santa Anna could not concentrate his full strength against General Winfield Scott's campaign in central Mexico, effectively dividing Mexican resistance and hastening the war's conclusion. The battle's impact on American public opinion proved as significant as its military consequences. Newspaper accounts of the fighting, carried by telegraph and horseback across the expanding nation, transformed Taylor from a competent general into a national hero, whose presidential ambitions would soon overshadow his military achievements. The image of old Rough and Ready calmly directing his outnumbered forces against overwhelming odds captured the American imagination and provided a powerful symbol of national determination. For Mexico, the defeat at Buena Vista represented more than a military setback. It marked the beginning of the end for Santa Anna's political career and Mexico's hopes of retaining its northern territories. The general who had dominated Mexican politics for 2 decades found his reputation permanently tarnished by his failure to crush Taylor's small army. The loss of veteran soldiers and experienced officers at Buena Vista weakened Mexican resistance throughout the remainder of the war. The tactical innovations displayed during the battle influenced American military doctrine for decades to come. The effective use of rifled firearms by Davis's Mississippi Regiment demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional Napoleonic tactics when faced with accurate long-range weapons. Artillery officers studied Bragg's concentrated bombardment techniques, while cavalry commanders analyzed the failure of Torrejon's charge against prepared infantry positions. Individual acts of heroism at Buena Vista became the stuff of American military legend, inspiring future generations of soldiers who faced similar odds in subsequent conflicts. The courage displayed by officers like Jefferson Davis and Thomas Sherman would be remembered when these same men faced each other across Civil War battlefields, where the lessons learned in Mexico would be applied with tragic effectiveness. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Buena Vista extended far beyond the immediate military situation in northern Mexico. Taylor's victory secured American control over the territories that would eventually become the southwestern United States. From California to Texas, the defeat of Santa Anna's northern army eliminated any realistic Mexican hope of reconquering Texas or preventing American expansion to the Pacific Ocean. As the years passed, the Battle of Buena Vista took its place among the most significant engagements in American military history. A testament to the power of determined leadership and individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the dusty battlefield in northern Mexico had witnessed the emergence of the United States as a continental power. secured through the sacrifice and heroism of soldiers who refused to yield despite facing impossible circumstances. Their legacy would inspire American forces in conflicts yet to come, proving that numerical superiority means nothing when confronted by superior will and determination.